Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about what may end up being the biggest, most hype game of the year from Nintendo, the widely reported now, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Remake for Nintendo Switch 2. It is technically a rumor, but it's coming from a lot of places now that are corroborating the information. This project you've been theorizing for such a long time, many now believe it to be true, and supposedly it's coming out later this year. And so this is going to be an ongoing topic. There's so many different angles to this conversation that I find extremely interesting. This is becoming my most anticipated game of the year. Of course, it's still not confirmed, so again, take it with a grain of salt. But with the idea of this project in mind, what we're hearing about it being a full remake, or that it has a very big budget according to what Special Nick has heard, this suggests some pretty big deal things. We're not just talking about just a visual enhancement, but we are talking about something perhaps along the lines of what Capcom has done with the Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4 remakes, or perhaps even something like what we've seen with the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy as well. And so if Nintendo is going to be making dramatic changes and evolutions to the Ocarina of Time for Switch 2, this iteration of it, there could be some very interesting changes here from a gameplay perspective, from a presentation story perspective, from a lore perspective. There's a lot of possibilities here. But one of the reasons why I've been so confident about this Ocarina of Time remake for such a long time is because the #1 leaker when it comes to Zelda projects has been hinting at this for a long time. Who's that #1 leaker? The Zelda series producer himself, Eiji Aonuma. And so now, looking at all the different interviews, actually, he may have been teasing this more than just once or twice, but perhaps 3 times, if not even more. Maybe there's something else out there. And with this information in mind we now have that's being widely reported, I think we actually can extrapolate even more details about what this project is going to entail from the man himself, Aonuma. So what has he been teasing about this game, the changes we might see? Well, that's what we're getting into today. You may have noticed that my voice sounds a bit different today. I actually am a little bit under the weather. However, if you do find yourself enjoying this video or some of my other videos, despite how sometimes I may be sick, I would very much appreciate your subscription if you haven't subscribed already. But getting into things here, let's first just kind of clarify the history of Aonuma teasing future Zelda projects. We've been over this before. He's teased so many future Zelda projects: Majora's Mask 3D, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, Skyward Sword HD on Switch, and the Link's Awakening remake as well on Switch. As we see here from this Nintendo Life article, back in 2016, Aonuma had said this: "Actually, Nintendo's been telling me to create a new IP, but then they're also telling me to make more Zelda games. I can't really share much. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say anything. But I really like the idea of a game where I can live as a thief. That's all I'll say." So he was teasing a remake for Link's Awakening, which came out 3 years later for Switch. And what's interesting is that later, it was confirmed in an issue of Edge that, yeah, that was a subtle hint. Aonuma confirmed that he was teasing this. So literally, Aonuma has even confirmed himself that he does tease future Zelda projects. And what I've noticed in looking at different interviews and such is that there is a correlation with Aonuma interjecting in English or laughing when saying something that seems a bit peculiar that could be suggesting something about the future. Like here, when he was talking about Zelda being playable in the future, Aonuma interjects in English and says maybe, 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 because he went and said something he wasn't supposed to say, and basically he leaked that, yeah, Princess Zelda will be playable in the next Zelda game, which was Echoes of Wisdom. But with this history established, let's now take a look at different interviews where Aonuma probably was teasing the remake for Ocarina of Time. So this is the one that really set everything into motion. There was this Game Informer interview conducted by Brian Shea, and he had asked Aonuma at the very end of the interview, "Thank you both so much for your time. I've heard about how sometimes questions about games can inspire them to be made. So I selfishly want to ask you about a modern Ocarina of Time remake, but I have a feeling I know the answer I'll get." And Aonuma laughs and said, "No comment." And to add to this a little bit more, I had initially reported about this and this correlation between Aonuma laughing and teasing future Zelda games, and Brian Shea, the person who conducted this interview, responded actually put a comment in the video and said this: "Hey, I'm the one who did the Game Informer interview with Aonuma and Fujibayashi and asked a question about the Ocarina of Time remake. Thanks for continuing to cover our interviews on Zelda. Since you pointed out that he will sometimes say his answers in English, I feel it pertinent to say that while I didn't type that he changed the language during the interview, he did in fact laugh, then say, no comment, in English." And so this moment right here fits right in line with the entire history of Aonuma teasing future Zelda projects. Now, some people might say, well, no comment doesn't mean that much, except it does, because he could have shot down the idea. Around the same time, there was another interview where he was asked about there being a Zelda game, like a Zelda game where you can make your own dungeons, a dungeon maker like Mario Maker but for Zelda, and Aonuma said, "And so I don't think that it would be a good fit for The Legend of Zelda to necessarily require people to build things from scratch and force them to be creative." Point being that if there was a dungeon maker in mind that Aonuma knew about, he probably would have said something to hint towards that, but he didn't. He shot down the idea. He did not shoot down the idea of the Ocarina of Time remake, and now it's being widely reported by so many. But this doesn't give us really any details about the game, just that Aonuma was hinting that they're working on it. However, there are other interviews where it looks like Aonuma was giving us details. So there was another interview that took place around the same time back in 2023, late 2023, in a Nintendo Dream magazine article here. And we see that Aonuma said this in regards to Rauru. Keep in mind this is a Japanese translation, which is why it says Raul instead of Rauru, but still, it's about Rauru. When I first heard that they were going to name him Rauru, I thought it was a very natural progression. But I wonder how many people are playing Tears right now and actually know the character of Rauru, ... ellipses, laughs. Again, keep in mind the laughing correlation. And so here Aonuma is wondering about how many people know who the original character of Rauru is. Now keep in mind, there is Rauru the town from Zelda 2, but Rauru the character is from Ocarina of Time. Now, Rauru the character from Ocarina of Time is the Light Sage. But the Rauru in Tears of the Kingdom is the first king of Hyrule. And so maybe in this instance, Aonuma is just talking about, well, we're going to see the name of Rauru become relevant again in another game in the not-so-distant future. Maybe that's all he was teasing here. Just another example of him getting at that they are working on remaking Ocarina of Time. But if we're talking about this remake being more than just a visual remake, but something that's a bit of a reimagining, which I do think makes a lot of sense if this is going to be the big holiday release for this year, and there's not going to be a 3D Mario or a mainline Pokemon or a new Animal Crossing or a new Smash, then this needs to be more than just a visual remake here. This needs to be a significant Zelda release that will tide fans over into the next new Zelda game, which I believe is probably still a few years away given the history of things. And so more work is going to need to be done here. And some of that work, as I alluded to earlier, may have to do with the gameplay, but also some of that work may have to do with recontextualizing the story and how they handle the presentation. Like, I imagine this Ocarina of Time remake is going to have voice acting now, but I also imagine some of the lines are going to change, some of the dialogue. They may change a little bit of the dialogue to reflect the modern Zelda games. Like, for example, when they depict Rauru from Ocarina of Time, there may be some mention of how he was named after the original king of Hyrule, that being the Rauru, the Zonai, we see in Tears of the Kingdom. And so Aonuma here could already be teasing that there are going to be changes to the story. And there are other changes that I think are needed, like perhaps referencing what's going on with the Rito, or perhaps giving us a better understanding of the Kokiri, who we understand eventually become Koroks. What is going on with that? Or perhaps they could explain what's going on with the Deku Tree in Age of Imprisonment. So Age of Imprisonment is the recent Zelda spin-off that just came out, a Hyrule Warriors game, and that's set in the past of Tears of the Kingdom. So Tears of the Kingdom, Princess Zelda goes back into the past where the founding of Hyrule occurred with the original king and queen of Hyrule, Rauru and Sonia. And so we see some memories there, but it's an Age of Imprisonment where we get to see a fair bit more, including other characters. And so we do see that Koroks are around all the way now at the beginning of the Kingdom of Hyrule, which would be before the Kokiri, but beforehand, we understood that the Kokiri became Koroks. So how are there Koroks before the Kokiri, and where is the Deku Tree? Because the Deku Tree is nowhere to be seen in Age of Imprisonment. I've been under the suspicion that Age of Imprisonment is a very intentional game to happen between Tears of the Kingdom and this Ocarina of Time remake, because there are things there that may hint at plot points or details that are expanded upon in the remake. Like, for example, I've wondered about Ganondorf's attendance, and when I say Ganondorf, I mean Ganondorf from Tears of the Kingdom, the first Ganondorf in the timeline according to Tears of the Kingdom. His attendants are Kotaka and Koemi, but they are young Gerudo women. However, in the events of Ocarina of Time, which would be a fair bit after the events of Tears of the Kingdom, the past part, not the current time with Link, Kotaka and Koemi are these ancient witches that have been around likely beyond your typical lifespan. I believe they are the same people, not a new reincarnation like most other characters, but the exact same Gerudo, just after many years and being witches and with all their powers, they're sticking around and they raised a new Ganondorf to follow the prior one. Now, you might be wondering, well, do we have any further hints connecting events in the past of Tears of the Kingdom and Age of Imprisonment to this Ocarina of Time remake? Well, with this information in mind, the whole idea that this is actually happening, there's another recent interview where I'm like, you know what? Aonuma was probably teasing this Ocarina of Time remake here. So, if you remember, just a few short months back, we had two pretty big interviews relating to Zelda. There was the Monolith Soft one, where it was just basically talked about that the Zelda team wants Monolith Soft to take on an even larger role for Zelda, perhaps hinting that Monolith Soft will have something to do with this Ocarina of Time remake, we shall see. But there was this other interview where Aonuma said this. Now keep in mind, this is another Japanese to English translation, so some of the wording's a little bit weird, but we can still get the gist. Seal of the Dragon, Age of Imprisonment, is the first Zelda title for Nintendo Switch 2. To be honest, we wanted to be the first to do this. Laughs. Again, keep in mind, the correlation of laughing and teasing future Zelda projects, it's so consistent. However, the inspiration we received from this collaboration with Koei Tecmo may be reflected in the Zelda game we create. While playing Zelda The Binding Blade, this is another way of saying Age of Imprisonment, please imagine that and look forward to our Zelda game. So yeah, the name for Age of Imprisonment is weird twice, but the point still stands. One, he's laughing when he's talking about how the Zelda team wanted to have the first Zelda game on Switch 2. Koei Tecmo beat them to the punch with Age of Imprisonment, but he's also talking about how there are things about Age of Imprisonment that may be reflected in the next Zelda game. So this implied that there's a Zelda game from the Zelda team that will be coming out relatively soon for Nintendo Switch 2. This year is the 40th anniversary for The Legend of Zelda, and now we have the widely reported Ocarina of Time remake supposedly coming out this year for the holiday season. Which would then suggest that this is the game that Aonuma was referring to, that they wanted to get out on Switch 2 first, and that there are things in Age of Imprisonment that would be reflected in the game. And so let's go back to what I was talking about earlier about all these potential lore implications. What's going on with the Deku Tree, the connection between the Kokiri and the Koroks? What of Kotaka and Koemi? Are they the exact same witches? Will they reference the original Ganondorf that's under Hyrule? Will Rauru the Sage reference Rauru, the first king of Hyrule? I think with this interview in mind, it now seems a lot more realistic that there could be a lot of interesting lore connections and implications between Tears of the Kingdom, between Age of Imprisonment, and this Ocarina of Time remake. Another example, what about the Rito? Like the Koroks, the Rito came into play in the Wind Waker, which suggested that like the Koroks, they wouldn't be around in prior times, but Age of Imprisonment tells us otherwise, that both the Koroks and the Rito are around during the founding of Hyrule. And so this Ocarina of Time remake has a grand opportunity to help to explain that, or perhaps just retcon that, but we will get an understanding of that. Some Zelda theorists doubt that the founding of Hyrule that's told about in Age of Imprisonment and Tears of the Kingdom is actually the founding of Hyrule. They think it's like a second cycle or something like that. Well, this Ocarina of Time remake may clarify on how exactly Nintendo looks at it. So even if you don't agree that there's going to be a connection here, we'll at least get some better hints or just a full-on understanding if there is a connection here. But you know, I think this could go beyond story as well. I don't think it's realistic to expect them to change Ocarina of Time into a full-on open-world game, but I do think they're going to expand on it, and I think there are various ways they could go about expanding on it. But specifically in reference to the interview here with Aonuma, thinking about what Age of Imprisonment might hint about the next Zelda game if it is an Ocarina of Time remake beyond just story and lore implications, would be the gameplay, right? Or the presentation. I've already talked about how they're probably going to improve on the presentation. I think most people will agree with that, and they'll probably will be voice acting. That's the new standard for Zelda now. But gameplay-wise, there's a lot of opportunity there. They probably won't expand the game into an open world, but they probably will incorporate maybe some elements from modern Zelda games, like a manual jump, for example. Maybe there will be a stamina meter. Maybe a lot of the items will have a wider variety of application, and so this may lead to dungeons changing around dramatically, but in an interesting way that still maintains the spirit, the essence of the original game. But also, within Age of Imprisonment, the combat is very good. And I think that's something that they could very easily focus on and modernize with Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time, for its time, pun not intended there, actually had very interesting combat. And I actually believe that over the generations, a little bit of that has been lost. Like, in a lot of ways, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have the most advanced combat in the series when you take everything into account. But when we're just talking about swordplay here or handling weapons, things have been simplified. And with modern games now that are like from the Soulsborne series or other third-person action adventures or open-world games, it feels like Zelda's actually fallen behind a fair bit. So it'd be really great if Nintendo could be going back to the drawing board here and reworking the combat, and perhaps there's inspiration taken from Age of Imprisonment as teased by Aonuma. I would love to see some revamped combat and revamped enemy patterns and such for Ocarina of Time Remake, and not just the common enemies but the bosses as well. I think there's a huge opportunity here to make something absolutely masterful. But that's what I believe is being suggested and teased from these different Aonuma interviews in regards to this now widely reported Ocarina of Time remake. But what do you all think? What do you think they're going to do for this next big Zelda game? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.